Hi, my name is James Dold. I am the CEO and founder of a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. called Human Rights for Kids. We work to advance human rights protections for children in the United States and hopefully one day around the world. I'm also a husband and a father, and I'm also a lawyer. But before I was all of those things, I was once a victim of child labor trafficking and sexual abuse. I wanted to share my story with all of you today in hopes of raising greater awareness of the terrible crime of trafficking of children and exploitation of children, and also to help inform the conversation around what exploitation of children looks like. I think most people on hearing my background and what I do, as well as my educational accomplishments, might not think that at one point in time I was this young kid who went through this terrible event. But as Brian Stevenson says, we are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And I've amended that to say that we are all more than the worst thing that's also ever happened to us. And so I hope that you take from my conversation today uh, what that means and what to look for when looking at people who have experienced these sorts of traumatic events and hopefully use it as a tool to prevent the trafficking of children. So my story really starts back in the seventh grade, actually right after I'd completed my seventh grade in middle school. I had joined the Boy Scouts of America through a local church, and like a lot of kids, was just I was looking for things to do outside of school and kind of keeping myself busy. And so my cousin and I, actually Justin, had become Boy Scouts through Christian Life Community Church, which was a local church in our neighborhood. And there was a woman who would round up all the neighborhood kids and take us to church, and she was a very nice woman for doing that. But in the Boy Scouts, during my seventh grade year, I unfortunately during one of the fundraisers that they had came across a family from a Cub Scout that was part of our Boy Scout troop, and they were a family. It was relatively innocuous. Their son was, I believe, 7 years old, and I was 13 years old, so I was about 5 years older than him. And they had a little girl, and on the outside, it sort of seemed like a picture perfect family. And that day, after the fundraiser, they offered to give my cousin and I a ride home, and we ended up actually going back to their house and getting to know them a little bit more. And over time, they formed this bond a little bit with us, and we would go back over to their house sometimes just to help with yard work. And I remember actually that was sort of the initial process in which my victimizer, who was a woman, who was the wife of and the mother of this Cub Scout in my Boy Scout troop, began to essentially groom me. And it started off, like I said, relatively innocuously. Right, I was a kid going over to this family. It was a Cub Scout in my Boy Scout troop. I think for my parents' part, they thought that everything was fine because these were people who we had met through the Boy Scouts that were connected to this church, and why would you worry? And anyway, it started for me as these small projects. We'd go over there to help them with yard work. They'd give us like $20, and it seemed fine. And then over time, um, I began to develop this, what I thought was this friendship with the woman. And um, and that included talking to me on the phone, taking me out to eat, um, And as a kid, there was a lot of things going on in my life at that time that where I didn't feel that I was getting the attention and the care and the love that I needed. And that created a dynamic where I was going to get it from somewhere, right? And this woman just happened to be that person who, was somebody who would listen to what I had to say. And unfortunately, I had earlier in my life experienced child sexual abuse at the hands of another child in my family. And that was never particularly resolved well by my mother. And that as a result of that, I developed this sense of resentment and anger. And you throw into the mix, the hormonal changes that go on with a 13-year-old boy. Um, and it's a very potent mix for a child to rebel, to develop this sense of anxiety and angst, and in some ways, I don't want to say hate, that's a very strong word, but this sense that uh, nobody really cared for me, and I was going to get, what I thought I needed from someplace, and this skilled child predator was that person at that time, and so over a period of months, this relationship continued to develop, and then and it like a lot of skilled predators, she slowly began to break down the walls of what was appropriate and what wasn't. It first started off as some of the inappropriate behaviors like wrestling and tickling, and had developed a crush on her, and so I was like, oh, this is fun, like she's tickling me and doing all these things to me, and I thought it was fun, and I thought that this was what I wanted to do, and as that continued that as that dynamic continued to unfold, uh, things progressively became less appropriate, and eventually led to inappropriate touching, where would start to uh, touch me in private areas, and uh, and then it escalated from there. Um, so going into my eighth grade year in middle school, that was the dynamic that was unfolding, and so as that was happening, uh, she was also driving this wedge between me and my family. And what I mean by that is, as I disclosed the prior sexual abuse that had occurred, she would, say things like, you know, I would never let anything like that ever happen to my children. If something like that happened, I would have, reported that person to the police, and, all of these different things that were things that I thought that I really needed to hear because I didn't get that validation of what happened to me, and for so long as a young child I carried so much shame and guilt from that event, and that abuse happened over a period of years. And so for me, I carried this sense of um, just shame with me, and guilt, and thinking that these things were my fault. And when I eventually built up that courage to tell my mother, um, she struggled, I think, to respond in a way that was helpful, in part because it was also one of her children. And but this skilled predator, of course, was telling me everything that I needed to hear. Despite the fact that here I was, this 13-year-old boy, now almost 14 years of age, and I couldn't see it for myself, right? When you're talking about teenagers, 13, 14-year-olds, um, we thought that, we knew it all. And we thought, like, as we're making decisions, this is what I want, right? Um, but of course, there are reasons why we don't let children make those sorts of decisions. It's because they don't have that capacity. And of course, like, 13, 14-year-old doesn't know that. They don't think that. And so, so for me, um, I I continued on this path with this woman, and the abuse just continued to escalate, and the wedge was driven further and further between me and my family, and that spread out into other areas of my life as well. So my friendships, she eventually told me that I couldn't talk to people about, her or, what was going on, especially a young girl. She had this fixation on being jealous of, other girls that I might be around. And so I completely, during the course of my eighth grade year, shut off from the entire outside world, where I just stopped talking to people. I stopped engaging. And every day after school, I was going over to her house where this abuse was continuing. And as that was unfolding, and I was going over to this house, at the same time that that was happening, I was also doing, what would be sort of thought of as common household chores. So I was babysitting, I was cooking and cleaning and taking care of kids, not just hers, but also the neighborhood, the other neighbors that they had. And so this became a routine for a number of months. And at the same time, as this is all happening, the grooming process is still ongoing. She's buying me, fast food, taking me to movies, concerts. I remember one distinct memory of the singer Jewel. I had a crush on her as a kid, and she was playing a midnight show one year at the Hard Rock on New Year's Eve, and she bought me tickets to go to that. And and so like these were things like I never thought I'd ever have the ability to do as a kid, and it just continued to build that level of trust. And then as that all happened, and as I'm being sort of slowly removed from my family, then we begin to enter into this sort of cycle of violence. So there comes a point where that sexual abuse escalates even further into a statutory rape situation. Again, something that I thought that I wanted at that time, because I thought that I loved this woman, and I thought that I was eventually going to be with her, and that she was the only one that really cared for me. And so I'm spending time at this house. All of this is happening. I'm cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, and this sexual abuse and this emotional abuse is taking hold. And I end up in a situation where the I was essentially in a cycle of violence. So as the sexual abuse is unfolding, there's also this emotional abuse that's happening, domestic violence or physical violence that's also unfolding, because whenever she was angry with me, or she thought that I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, uh, it essentially escalated into, oh, you're this or you're that. Sometimes racial epithets were used. It's worth noting that she was a white woman, and I was this, mixed kid. And, and her family, on a pretty regular basis would also, refer to me as the N word. And, they definitely wanted me gone. They thought that I was, why was I this kid that was living there? And, her excuse was, to them that, James doesn't have anywhere to go. There's this abusive situation happening at his house. Like, we need to take care of him. Meanwhile, she herself is sexually abusing and exploiting me for labor. And so at this point, I want to just kind of stop and talk a little bit about the dynamic that existed for me in this situation, and explain a little bit about traumatic bonding. Traumatic bonding is known as this dysfunctional attachment that occurs when victims essentially uh, develop this misplaced sense of loyalty to their abusers. It's oftentimes seen in domestic violence situations. It's seen in exploitative cults. It's commonly referred to as Stockholm syndrome, where people who go through traumatic events end up empathizing with their abuser or victimizer, and in some ways can be more empathetic to them than those who are actually trying to help them. And it happens in these high pressure situations. And for children, it's especially acute because oftentimes, particularly children in trafficking situations, what happens is there's almost always some prior childhood trauma. Not always, but usually. And, there's some vulnerability that makes them particularly susceptible to a child predator coming into their life and engaging in exploitative practices, such as sexual abuse. And so this grooming process transpires where trust is developed. The child lets the abuser in. The bond continues to form because the showering of gifts and compliments and the showing of attention that the child may not be getting somewhere else, and then over time that trust that's developed is used as essentially a weapon to begin the cycle of violence or abuse, where it could be sexual abuse, it could be physical abuse, and the child in the situation believes that it's their fault that this is happening. It's or in some instances, they may be just like I was, where they think like, oh, this person loves me. I want to do this. I want to engage in this relationship with this person because I feel like they love me, and it's what I want, and it's what they want, and this is the person I want to be with. And so as that unfolds, especially kids who, again, we're young at that time, we're naive about the world, don't know anything about, sex or relationships or anything like that, and so this bond that gets formed, and then you throw into the mix also somebody who's an adult, right, and in a position of authority and power, and the dynamic is just it becomes this overbearing sense of a feeling that you have this obligation to this person, and you have this desire to want to make them happy, and that it's the most intense feeling of infatuation and what you think is love, and it's almost sort of obsessive. You feel like you can't do anything to get out of that situation, and as a result you become willing to do just about anything to make that person happy. And that really is the basis for most children in the United States, especially, but also around the world, who end up in human trafficking situations. Uh, Unfortunately, in pop culture, it's sort of been normalized, this idea of taken, people being kidnapped off the streets, all this, that certainly it happens, but it's very rare. Most trafficking situations are actually skilled child predators who target young, vulnerable children who lack self-esteem, who have things going on in their background or in their household that make it easier for someone to come in and show that love, affection, and attention that the child isn't getting, and develop that exploitative relationship. And whether you're talking about sex trafficking or labor trafficking, the dynamic can be very, very similar. Right, so that bond that's formed with that abuser then is used as the tool that the trafficker uses to get the child to go out and do whatever they want. In sex trafficking situations, it's go out there and meet your nightly quota and be exploited in prostitution. In my case, it was come home and come home to my house and take care of kids and cook and clean and do what I tell you and do what I ask you to do. Otherwise you're not going to have that love and that affection. I'm going to tell you to go back to your house. I don't want you to be here. And so that threat of that loss of not having that person becomes essentially these invisible chains, right? Because you feel so deeply that you love them and that you're willing to do anything for them. And so for me, I ended up running away from my house, where my parents were. So it started off in my eighth grade year of me, going from school over to their house and staying there, late in the night, and then her dropping me back off at my house, where my parents lived. And then escalated after my eighth grade year, where I actually left my parents' house and I moved in and lived with this family, and that was a very difficult thing. I felt that this person again was the only person that I had in the world, and that my parents, didn't really care for me and love me. And I think for me, sort of subconsciously, that took hold also because of the fact that there wasn't this attempt to, you know, really stop me or, call the police. Or there were so many points in time where um, nobody really intervened to stop what was happening. And I think that that's what made my situation that much worse, was that I was sort of this forgotten child in many ways. And and so, long story short, uh, I end up living at this house for a period of about 2 years. I eventually was able to break free of this manipulative hold, this trauma bond that I had developed with my abuser about midway through my sophomore year in high school. As one might expect with the dynamic that was happening. I should also say that as this abuse was happening with me, there were other young boys that she was also abusing. And I was very much aware of this, but again, my trauma bond was such that, like, I was always like, okay, I always went back to this place like, oh, she's abusing another kid, like that's, and I didn't think of it as an abuse at the time. I thought about it as like, oh, she's having this relationship with this other child, and I always thought like, oh, like what am I doing wrong, like what has led to this? And so for me, that was, again, a complicating factor because I was always in the state of trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. And in addition, and it wasn't just boys either. She was having an affair with several men, and she would always tell me about it almost as a way to sort of, I don't know if it was like rubbing it in my face or just sort of, just another a tactic to emotionally abuse and harm me in a way that just really always seemed to drive another dagger through my heart. And it always made me feel like, okay, what do I need to do to make sure she doesn't do this again? Like, it's me. Like, the reason she keeps doing this is because of me. And meanwhile, she's also married and she has this family that happens. And so, as you might expect, like, that whole dynamic begins to crumble. She separates from her husband, leaves her children. I follow her. She moved in with her parents, so I actually followed her and lived with her and her parents for a while. And then shortly after that, as more time ended up uh, 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 passing, I ended up sort of, two things happened. One was I made the decision to move back in with my parents, and in part that was also facilitated by the fact that uh, her mother was not happy about me now living in this house with her, and so that helped to sort of facilitate my exit from that situation. But also, it was also the case that. Um, as that's happening during my sophomore year in high school, I happened to wander onto a football field, and um, I met some really great coaches, and I ended up really dedicating myself to playing football and wrestling in high school. And that gave me the outlet that I really needed to focus the pain that I was feeling in this sense of not being enough, and really redirecting all of that negative energy into sports. And I became obsessive with that. That became, my this new obsession that I had, and especially with wrestling. And and thankfully, I had amazing coaches that um, probably sensed that there's this kid that it was an inner city school, so I think a lot of the coaches there figured that a lot of the kids that are playing sports are going through issues in their lives at home and in their communities that are tough. And but these coaches really cared, and taught me a great deal about myself and my own self-worth, and what it meant to be somebody of value. And it was through that that it just became easier for me to disconnect from that situation. And I eventually was able to. And I eventually got to a point as well where I became strong enough to cut off all contact from her. And eventually, you know, get back to some semblance of normalcy by the time I was a senior in high school. And but those scars, definitely stayed with me, and there was a lot of impact from that, including how I behaved post that in high school. I became this very sort of immature kid, and I was kind of a class clown and jokester. I was sort of always looking for validation or attention as I sort of transitioned from being this sort of quiet kid who dressed in all black and who was kind of weird and awkward. Um, and part of it, I think, was it was hard for me. How do you go back to being a normal high school kid after, you know, even though I was going to school that whole time, although I was often tardy and late, and but how do you go back to any sense of normalcy when the socialization that happens between, your eighth grade year and your sophomore year in high school is completely gone, because I wasn't allowed to talk to kids my age. I wasn't allowed to engage with girls my age and figure out like what, who I was, and what kind of friendships and relationships I could have formed with other children. And so when I came out of that situation, I was incredibly awkward in talking with girls and talking even with like boys my age. It was a very strange phenomenon. And the only way I really knew how to sort of cope with that was to sort of, as I sort of emerged from this sort of cocoon, was to, be this sort of jokester and class clown, and but sort of beneath the surface, there was this pain that I was dealing with. Um, and so that, is my story. It's a little bit unconventional and probably unlike many stories that folks might hear. But it's one where, I was, a victim of involuntary servitude, and what the method of control that was used to control me was this traumatic bond that I developed with this very skilled child sexual predator. And once that trauma bond took hold, I was willing to do anything that she asked of me. And you know, and to sort of accentuate that point too on the impact of trauma bonds, the lowest point that I ever got to, I remember this very vividly. There was some sort of incident that happened at the house, and when I was living there, and she had become very angry with me, and I was trying to figure out like what I had done, and so I was trying to talk to her, and I was like, please tell me what, why are you doing this? Why, what's going on? It was because it was this constant state of gaslighting. And she finally got angry with me because I was trying to press her on why she was treating me this way. And she just started, punched me in the face several times, and, eventually fell down. And I just started crying, because I didn't, I didn't know what I had done to deserve how she was treating me. And I also felt that there was nothing I could do to change the dynamic. And it was always my fault, but I didn't know what I was doing. And I think I was around 14 or 15 when this incident happened. And at that time, I remember there was a gun in the house, and I remember after that incident of being beaten and just sort of emotionally torn down, I went into her closet and pulled out this gun, and I held it to my head, and it was a 22. It was a small gun, um, and I wasn't in a place where I was going to pull the trigger or anything, but I wanted to feel um, what it was like uh, to imagine death, because I felt that that was the only way I was ever going to get to a place of peace and calm, and where I didn't have this constant anxiety. And, um, I just stayed there in the dark crying and holding this gun, and just imagining what that was like, sort of this idea of peace and serenity. Anyway, I put the gun away. Um, after a few minutes of this imagining, and um, I went back and kind of went back about my day, and um, And it was hard. The whole situation was hard. But it's an example of how, as a kid, you could be in this situation where you're not doing anything wrong, but because there's this skilled abuser, um, uh, you feel that you are. You feel that everything's your fault, but you don't know why. And it's this constant search of like, well, why is it that I'm being treated this way? And because you blame yourself, you're willing to do anything. And that's, for me, was being exploited in this situation where I was a domestic servant for this family for several years. There were points along the way that adults could have intervened. Teachers at my school, teacher aides, definitely noticed, like, there was something wrong with me, and they tried to pay as much attention to me as possible and figure out, like, what's going on with James. And so, like, you know, the thing that I would highlight for educators particularly, if you see a kid that, their demeanor significantly changes, where they go from sort of being this sort of happy-go-lucky kid to being sort of, pulled out from everything and withdrawn, something's going on. Something's going on in that child's life. And, I think there's a tendency to sometimes ignore those sorts of things and not pay attention to them. But you never know what can be going on. And so, if you see a kid like that, it's important, I think, to ask questions and to continue to engage and continue to prod and talk to their family and figure out, are there other adults in this kid's life? Is there any dynamic that's shifted recently? Asking prodding questions to kind of figure out what is the reason for this shift in attitude and mindset. And that was hard. That was a hard dynamic for teachers. I think to sometimes figure out, but I think sometimes asking those questions can be helpful. The other thing is perhaps the people that were most culpable for the situation outside of my parents, who, I denied to them, that anything bad was going on. But my cousin, knew otherwise and had tried to explain to them what was going on. And I think, there's a tendency on the part of parents sometimes to not want to imagine the worst case scenario. But sometimes, I think you have to, in order to protect children from what's actually happening. And so I think being involved in children's lives is critical, and asking those prodding questions, as uncomfortable as it might be, because you just don't know, especially when there are other adults in the picture. And that's another really important thing that I would flag. Parents and teachers, everyone's always worried about, the predator hiding in the bushes. Most kids, over 90% of kids who are sexually abused, are abused by somebody they know. Somebody they know. And that is a very hard dynamic for people to accept, because we don't want to accept the fact that there are predators among us. Okay? But it's absolutely essential to protecting children, to understand that the people who are likely to abuse your children are your neighbors. They're people in the Boy Scouts. They're volunteer parents. They are, people in positions of authority who get close to kids in order to abuse them. And so be aware of that. And understand that is a dynamic in humanity that exists. The other thing, there were people in the Boy Scouts and at the church who suspected that something was amiss. I spent a lot of time around her in these different environments, right? As these months unfolded, I eventually quit the Boy Scouts because I was questioned about the nature of the relationship, because people had begun to notice, like, what's why is he always around her, and why is she always around him, and like this seems really inappropriate, like they're constantly together. And they were right. But nobody reached out to my parents, nobody called the police, nobody did anything. And as I reflect on some of the worst parts of that experience for me, it's that dynamic. It's the fact that people suspected but did nothing. Don't be that person who does nothing, because the worst thing in the world that can happen is you do nothing, and then a child spends the next couple of years in a literal hell, being sexually abused, being physically abused, being emotionally abused, and being exploited for labor. And the whole time them thinking it's their fault. And I wish there had been an adult in the room, or even a peer of my age, who would have had the courage and conviction to do what was right. So remember, no matter how much, now, no matter how hard it is, no matter how much it might hurt, it's really important to do what is right. And if you suspect or you know that somebody you know or one of your students is in an exploitative situation, you gotta talk to authorities. You gotta talk to their parents. You gotta talk to other adults, because the risk of not doing so, it can be catastrophic. I was fortunate, to escape that situation and to remain, relatively, balanced and continue on with my studies. I was the only person in my family who my parents raised who graduated from high school. I became a first-generation college graduate and then eventually a lawyer. That path was hard. And that entire time that I was, going to school and getting away from the environment that I came from, that was something that loomed in the background constantly. And eventually, I spent years in therapy talking about that dynamic, although I'd healed pretty well from it. But the issues that led to me being in that situation were things that took many years of therapy for me to address. And so, that's my story. I hope it's helpful in thinking through these issues and understanding what human trafficking and what child labor trafficking actually looks like. There's a tendency to think about this issue very myopically. People are like, it's sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking. Oftentimes there's elements of both, right? Especially for kids who have developed this traumatic bond. What you'll see is whether somebody is primarily a sex or labor trafficking victim, there may be instances where there's also sexual abuse or exploitation going on on the labor trafficking side, or if it's child sex trafficking, labor trafficking, right? If they're a trafficker, if they have this traumatic bond and they're doing anything that their trafficker has asked them to do, including being exploited in prostitution, when they're coming home, it's likely that they're also being exploited in labor by doing many of the same things that I described that I was having to do. That includes taking care of kids and cooking and cleaning. And so it's important to think about the provision of household chores and thinking about, kids who might be going to school, might be doing relatively well in school, like it was for me. I wasn't, my grades certainly dropped, but it wasn't, so significant. I still did relatively well in my studies. So to the outside world, if you looked on paper, like, this kid might be doing well in school. But at the end of the day, they might also be going through a significant hell that people just don't know about. And so that's why it's really important to ask these questions, to understand what to look for, understand what makes people vulnerable, and to watch out for significant changes in behavior. for children. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my story with you. It's a little bit lengthy, but I hope it's helpful in preventing other people, other children from having to experience what I did. And to leave on a more positive note, there's always hope. If I can overcome what I went through, anyone can also overcome it with a little bit of support and guidance from people in their lives. And so it's also an important lesson for educators to be that guiding light for children, because you never know what they might be going through. And if you're going through a similar situation, if anything in my story resonates with you, just know that you're not alone. You're not alone, and it will get better. And it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And as hard as it might be, you can talk to your teachers. You can talk to folks who will help you. I promise you that. It'll get better. Thank you all so much for spending these several minutes with me. Thank you.